Hi, everybody. I thought I would go over where Southern California gets its water from, but it's just as valid for anywhere in California. Where our water sources are is really pretty important. When you take a look at this map, you can see that the majority of us live in the bottom 1/3 of the state, and yet there's very, very little water in the bottom 1/3. And some of the water that we have is man-made, like the Coachella Canal, or the Salton Sea, which was caused by a flooding accident and is not drinkable. So once you get below Kern County, it's pretty sparse as far as water sources. But another thing I love about this map is it has a really good view of all the different rivers that are in Northern California, fed by the Sierra Nevadas, and in Central California, also fed by the Sierra Nevadas. And there's a vast amount of water available in the state, just not where we live. So where does Southern California get its water? Well, we get it from natural supplies, right? Our own groundwater, our own precipitation, our own very small rivers and creeks. Some instances we get it from the ocean, right, through desalination. Then there are a lot of man-made rivers. There's the LA Aqueduct, the California Aqueduct, which is part of the State Water Project, and the Colorado River Aqueduct, which is owned by Metropolitan Water District. I already mentioned local supplies, and then conservation is considered a valid source of water, and that makes sense. If we get people to stop using so much water here in our own area, it makes a lot of sense that we can then use that water for necessary personal use like drinking, bathing, cooking, the things that we must have water for to live. Now, I wanted you to get a look at what an aquifer looks like underground. This would, you can think of an aquifer basically is a large underground pool, just like a swimming pool, and it's where we get groundwater from. You know, we don't see so much of our water sources because they are underground, and we don't think about that in terms of pollution or protection of our groundwater sources, and yet it is the largest supply of water in Southern California. Okay, so you can think of a well as a straw that we would put into a cup of water. A well is just another way to get water to the surface from the groundwater basin. Groundwater basins are broken up. Now, they don't always look exactly like this. Okay, this is showing you a particular basin, courtesy of Orange County Water District. But at the very top, you have the shallow aquifer, then you have the principal aquifer, and then you have the deep aquifer. So the shallow aquifer is where we get a lot of our water. Okay, the deeper you drill a well, the more expensive it is. So you want to get your water from the top if possible, but understand that that is also the water that is more likely to be polluted. So sometimes you have to break through. They represent with a black line underneath the word shallow aquifer, they have a black line. That would be what's called a confining layer. Maybe it's dirt, maybe it's rock, maybe it's clay, and you might have to break through and get to the principal aquifer where the water is typically a little bit cleaner. What we don't use generally is deep aquifer water. And the reason is it's very expensive to drill that far down and maintain that well to get to that water. You will also hear deep aquifer water referred to as fossil water. Just like there's fossil fuels that are deep in the earth, there's also fossil water. One really interesting thing about this particular slide is if you look at the top where you see Huntington Beach, and underneath the words Huntington Beach, you'll see injection wells. Injection wells are used to reverse the course of water. So in this case, you have Anaheim to the right, then you have Santa Ana, then you have Huntington Beach, and obviously the ocean is on the far left side, represented by the words Pacific Ocean. Salt water is heavier than fresh water, so it often tries to infiltrate your aquifers. Once it infiltrates your aquifer, the aquifer is ruined. You can't really get it back. So you see up there, there's some injection wells. Those work just like regular wells, only in reverse. They push water back into the ground. The purpose of that is to keep the salt water from the ocean separated from the aquifer. It essentially pushes salt water back out to the ocean so that the aquifer doesn't get contaminated. As you note along the bottom, there's 525 distinct basins within California. And unfortunately, and we may get to this later, California was the last state to come up with groundwater management laws or plans. Now, I mentioned 3 on there: Chino Basin, Six Basins, and Bunker Hill Basin. Chino Basin is a very, very large basin, and it supplies water to almost all of the Inland Empire and some of Orange County. Six Basins is an example of a really small basin. It's up toward the foothills around Upland. And then there's Bunker Hill Basin, which supplies the city of Riverside, as well as Redlands and some areas out in the Inland Empire. Bunker Hill is also pretty good size, but Chino Basin is much, much bigger. Okay, we're going to go on to the next slide. I wanted you to look at the Santa Ana River watershed. It's actually a very large watershed, believe it or not. It's over 2,600 miles. And it is our watershed, and that's why I wanted you to pay attention to it. It's from the San Bernardino and San Gabriel Mountains all the way to the Pacific, right around Huntington Beach. There's actually, if you're ever interested, there's a beautiful bike trail that you can ride along the Santa Ana River. And eventually it's going to go all the way from the top of the basin in the mountains down to the ocean. So it's pretty cool, actually. We get a fair amount of water out of this watershed. And that's kind of shocking because the rivers don't seem very big, but that's because you're used to bigger rivers like the Colorado, or if you go back east, you're even used to the Mississippi and the Ohio. Anyway, our watershed covers 10 vegetation zones, and it has 2 dams in it, Seven Oaks and Prado Dam. Seven Oaks is a relatively new dam. Prado Dam is the one that's around the Green River exit area on the 91, and across it, it says 200 Years of Freedom. There's a beautiful mural on it. That dam impedes all of this water. It holds it back. The dam is also actually operated by Orange County Water District, and the golf course that you see on the far side is also owned by Orange County Water District because they have the rights to a lot of the water that comes out of the Santa Ana River. The Santa Ana River is really a source of contention for almost everybody along it. The people up in the top of the dam or the top of the watershed don't think they get enough water. Orange County wants all the water. It's a big mess. But I did want you to have some idea of our own watershed and our own river. Lest you think that the Santa Ana River is a pitiful small river, you can see from these pictures that before it was dammed, it created a tremendous amount of havoc when it flooded. The picture on the left is the bridge that is basically in Yorba Linda now. That's what Yorba Linda used to look like. The water took the bridge right out. And the picture on the right is the Corona area. And that's what it used to look like in Corona. It was a lot of farmland. And the last big flood that they had, that I believe this picture is from the flood of 1938. It created an incredible amount of damage and lives lost as well. So the Santa Ana River can be quite a force to be reckoned with. So the picture on the left is where the headwaters start of the Santa Ana River. And it does go about 100 miles. Altogether, if you included its tributaries, it's about 700 miles. And, it used to be full of fish and native fish and native birds and a lot of native vegetation. But as we've urbanized, a lot of that has been lost, as you can see in the picture on the right. In my other class, we talk a lot about channelization and what happens when you channelize rivers. We did that at a time when we thought it was appropriate and that the object should be to get the water to the ocean as quickly as possible. You will find in places like Los Angeles, they're now removing these channels. The object should not be to get the water to the ocean as quickly as possible because it does some degradation to the ocean and everything along the way. But it also doesn't feed any of the ecosystems that are along the way. The Santa Ana River had some unique fish, plants, and animals: the Santa Ana sucker, the three-spined stickleback, and the Leesbells vireo. Behind the Prado Dam is a reconstructed wetlands, and it is home to the Leesbells vireo bird. It is a beautiful little bird. They mate for life, so that causes a problem if something happens to one of the birds. And it is an endangered species. Consequently, there's not a lot of building going on during nesting season or breeding season, which makes water operations managers really angry. But I myself am more of an environmentalist. I think if you can do construction at another time, you might as well save the birds. And they have sort of made a small comeback, but nothing like their previous numbers as they had. Now we're going to talk about imported supplies, and there's primarily three sources for Southern California. And you'll find that shocking because I have four listed there, but there's really three sources, and we'll talk about the fourth. So there's the Colorado River watershed, there's the San Joaquin Sacramento River Delta, which you hear about a lot, there's the Owens River Valley, and then there's the Central Valley Project. The first one I'm going to talk about is the Central Valley Project, and it's the one I kind of disregard. And the reason I do that is it's a Bureau of Reclamation project. It's a federal project, and it's primarily agriculture water. And since we don't really deal with a lot of agriculture in Southern California, you need to know about it, but we don't really have it as a source. It's not a steady source for us in what we do primarily for a living. But I do want you to know a little bit about it. So there's 18 dams and reservoirs, there's 3 fish hatcheries, there's 11 hydroelectric plants. And something to remember about hydroelectric plants is that they're great sources of clean electricity, right? It's not fossil fuel driven, so it's a little bit cleaner. And it was originally for flood control, navigation, and river regulation, and it provided low-cost water to agriculture. Again, it is a federal project and it's administered federally. That's important to remember. Then we have the Colorado River. And if anything has launched Southern California, it would be the Colorado River. In fact, I'd go so far as to say if we didn't have the Colorado River Aqueduct, we would have no Southern California. There is no harder working river in the entire world. Every drop is claimed, reclaimed, divided, and subdivided. And it basically, I want you to look at the states that are covered there. This is always a test question. What 7 states are part of the Colorado River Basin? They are California, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. There is also a treaty with Mexico so that the country of Mexico gets some water from our aqueduct or from the Colorado River Basin. The treaty is based on historical data. The river always flowed all the way down to the ocean, down to the Colorado River Delta, into the Gulf of California. So when the treaty was designed, it included Mexico in that treaty. Another thing that I want to point out to you here is there is a small dotted line that's red across the center, and that is the dividing line. The dividing line is from the upper basin states to the lower basin states. And Lee's Ferry, which is literally a place where people used to take a ferry across to the other side of the river, it's Lee's Ferry. So remember that. The lower basin states, there's 3 of them. There's California, Nevada, and Arizona. The upper basin states are Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. It's important to remember that. Okay, so I want you to have that fixed in your mind. What makes the Colorado River so special? Well, it is our river. If I tell you I'm going to the river this weekend, you know exactly where I am going. This picture is a picture of Horseshoe Bend. I have actually rafted that. It's quite calm at this point, quite beautiful. It's also very, very cold. The Colorado River Basin drains 243,000 square miles. So it's quite a river, but nothing compared to something like the Mississippi, the Ohio, or the Allegheny, which you learned about in our westward expansion lesson. It carved the Grand Canyon. That's kind of a misnomer. Really, the land rose around the river. The river did not corrode the land. The river's almost 1,500 miles long, and it is allocated to the 7 states we talked about, Mexico, Native Americans, and the federal government. Over allocated means that there is more water allocated to these entities than is actually in the river. So the river starts in a negative each time. Moving on with the Colorado River, it was first explored by Anglos, I should have put that in there, in 1869. Of course, Native Americans had lived along the Colorado River for centuries, for thousands of years. But the first white man was Powell, and he explored it in 1869. He's an interesting sideline all on his own. I'm not going to go into that, but look him up sometime. He's who Lake Powell is named for. The Colorado River Compact came along in 1922, and what that was 26 cities and agencies formed MWD in 1928. So how did that work together? Well, the compact is actually a legal agreement that decides how the river is going to be allocated or divvied up. Then MWD was formed from these 26 cities and agencies to actually distribute the water from the Colorado River. That was done in 1928. They immediately started to build the aqueduct, and it was completed in 1941. That is also an interesting sideline you might want to look up sometime. When you look at these engineering feats, you have to remember that they were done with not modern engineering tools. They were done basically with levels and compasses and very crude tools. So they built it and completed it in 1941. MWD, or Met, still owns the aqueduct. They maintain it and take care of it. Now, there were 2 main diversions off it once it hit Southern California. One was for Los Angeles and one was for San Diego. San Diego and Los Angeles already had thriving populations at that point, and they needed water. And that was for residential use, but primarily the aqueduct is for irrigation water. So even though MWD, Met, built the aqueduct, they only have 4th priority to the water in the aqueduct. I think Imperial Irrigation District is number 1. I'd have to check. But they maintain it to this day. So let's look at how the water was allocated in the compact. From the pictures on the right, you can see that the Colorado River is very drought prone. There's a large amount of states, most of the western states have some sort of drought every year, if not every other year, and it's extremely reactive. So the original allocations, which still hold today, are New Mexico for 0.8 million acre feet, Wyoming for 1 million acre feet, Utah for 1.7 million acre feet, Colorado for 3.9 million acre feet, Nevada for 0.3 million acre feet, Arizona for 3.5 million acre feet, and California for 4.4 million acre feet. Now, you probably want to ask yourself, why were these allocations set up like this? Well, remember, this was in the 1920s, and there wasn't much going on in Nevada at that time. It was before air conditioning, for example, so the city of Las Vegas was nothing. The 0.3 million acre feet they get from the Colorado River is what fuels the city of Las Vegas. California already had a thriving agriculture industry, which is why they came up with 4.4 million acre feet. I find it odd that they would get more than Colorado at 3.9 million acre feet, for which the river and the aqueduct are named. California puts no water into the aqueduct or into the system, and yet gets the majority of the water out of the system. Colorado puts the majority of the water in, but the other states also contribute something except for California, and yet have much smaller allocations. Now we're going to move on to the State Water Project. And that's a lovely picture on the right of the State Water Project. It goes on for miles and miles. There are 660 miles of conveyance. Conveyance is a nice way to say pipeline or river road, right? Aqueduct. So that's all conveyance means. It's just a fancy word for river pathway or river road. There are 32 storage facilities, which would be dams or reservoirs. There's 17 pumping plants, and there are 5 hydroelectric plants along the State Water Project. That helps it pay for itself because it's expensive to move imported water. It serves drinking water to 23 million people, mostly dispersed throughout Southern California. Oops, I think I went too far. No, I didn't. The main rivers that put water in, the largest rivers, are the Sacramento River and the San Joaquin River, which you saw a short video on earlier in another module. Actually, it's the same module. And there's a lot of challenges surrounding the Delta. As you've seen from other things, the Delta was originally a vast wetland full of birds, animals, wildlife, Native Americans, etc. But once it started to be farmed and you have pesticides going into the water and people living there and land being reclaimed, it really changed the way that the Delta works. So you've come up with a lot of challenges. One of them is the ecosystems there are in serious trouble. A lot of the original birds, fish, plants are gone or on their way out. Part of the way that they delivered water to and created farmland was by making levees, and the levees are extremely fragile. Many of them are very old now. 80% of commercial fish come through the Delta at some point, leading to a very large commercial fish industry. So anything we do to the Delta is going to impact commercial fishermen. There's ocean water intrusion. What you're looking at in the pictures and throughout the Delta is primarily fresh water. So when salt water invades, of course, it kind of kills everything in its path, and it's not good for crops either. Original fish species like the Delta smelt, we'll see them in a minute, they're crashing. They can't survive in this environment. And then you also have what court-ordered pumping reductions. In the summer, when we need water, they used to export a lot of water from the Delta, and that impacted the environment even more, which led people to sue, which led to court orders that reduced when you could pump water and how much water you could pump. Most of this centers around the fish you see on the right, which is the Delta smelt. I say centers around, it's just the bottom of the food chain. If you know food chains from biology, this is the smallest little fish. Something bigger feeds on that, something bigger feeds on that, and so on and so forth, all the way up the food chain ladder. So the problem is if this fish goes and you no longer have this fish, then it's very likely that everything else that fed on this fish or inadvertently fed on this fish is also going to die. That's why this fish in particular is the one that's watched the most frequently. You also hear it be the butt of the most jokes. Everybody will say, oh, it's a little minnow, it's a little this, it's a little that. That really belies the fact that it's really critical to the ecosystem in those areas. Some interesting facts about the smelt. It's a pretty small fish. It's about 3 or 4 inches long at adulthood. It only lives 1 year, so it has 1 year to be born, do its little fish thing, reproduce, and then die. Supposedly it smells like cucumbers. That's a little oddity. And they used to be literally in the Delta in millions of fish, and there have been considerably less fish. They do go out, they take college students, they go out and count them. And their population has just plummeted. There just aren't very many, which affects everything else in the food chain. The picture on the right is what the Delta looks like. So at one point, that was all a wetlands area. Where you see the rivers now, or creeks, what they did is they actually basically dug those rivers out, those smaller rivers out, and created islands where people can farm, and then they're fed from the surrounding rivers. Now we're going to move on to the LA Aqueduct. And the LA Aqueduct is a fascinating study in water supply, engineering, ethical practices. When is it right to take water from another community? When is it not? It was also very loosely the inspiration for the movie Chinatown, which you may hear about from time to time. I would encourage you to watch that movie because it gives you a seamy side of water that isn't completely accurate, but is still interesting nonetheless. And it really is all surrounding this next section of our lecture, which is the LA Aqueduct. So what you're looking at is the Owens River Valley, and the small river that you see, the small creek in there, used to be all the way across the valley. It was not just this small enclosed waterway that you're looking at in the picture. It stretched clear to the mountain. This was fed by the Eastern Sierras. It's the eastern side of the Sierras. And it was really masterminded by a gentleman named Fred Eaton. LA was at a time when it needed more water to grow. They had outrun the LA River. They were using more water than that. And the San Fernando Valley area in particular needed more water so that they could continue to build and prosper in the city of Los Angeles. So unwittingly, or wittingly, they decided to start looking for other places to get water. And where they decided to get it from was the Owens River Valley. And it's pretty much never been the same in Southern California water since then. The construction of the first aqueduct was in 1908, and it took approximately 5 years. It was really an engineering feat. The entire aqueduct, the first aqueduct, is gravity fed. They did it with very, very crude tools. Remember also that it employed a lot of men. At a time when jobs were not guaranteed, these were very good jobs to have. So it employed at any time from 1150 to over 6,000 men to work on this. Some men worked for 5 years on the aqueduct. It was built with bond money, so it was entirely legal. They floated a bond, and they got people to invest. And so that's how they actually funded it. Now, it was physically built. It was masterminded by Fred Eaton, but it was physically built by William Mulholland. William Mulholland was an interesting person. He was I think a Scottish immigrant to the United States. He came here as a very young man. He was uneducated, so he self-taught himself. He started as a ditch digger for LADWP and worked his way up to the general managership, where I think he was the general manager for a few decades. He had an incredible memory. He could remember where every valve, every spigot, every hydrant was. And he was a self-taught engineer. So he actually physically worked on the plans to build the LA Aqueduct, although he was not what we call now a stamped or board-certified engineer. It has 6 reservoirs on it, 213 miles of pipeline, and it has 2 hydro plants on it. Here's a good picture of it. So when we talk about the LA Aqueduct, there are really 3 parts to it, but nobody talks about the second part and the third part. They talk about them so little that it's very difficult to even find concrete dates on when they got the second aqueduct done. I researched it and couldn't find it. The one that is really the cause for speculation is the first one that was built from 1908 to 1912. And you can see on the map where the aqueduct was. And it delivered water all the way to the San Fernando Valley. Let me go on. So as we saw on the other slide, and I didn't really give you this knowledge. So Fred Eaton, when he wanted to buy it, he spent the years before 1908 quietly buying up property from farmers in the Owens River Valley. And what he would do is he would go to the land office and he would go to visit town, and he would send other people to do this as well, and they would snoop around as to what farmers were in trouble. Then he would go to the land office, he would find the farms that actually were on the river because they had the best water rights, and then he would quietly buy them. So that he eventually ended up, the city of LA ended up being the major landholder in this area. That's the only way they got the aqueduct built. They couldn't have built it any other way. So they finished the first aqueduct, and the farmers that are left in the valley are ruined. There's no water. LA starts just removing every drop they can and transporting it to the San Fernando Valley, leaving not enough water for people to even have the most minor sustenance of farming. And people got mad, and they formed a co-op, what's called a co-op. It's like a group, a citizens group in 1923. And LA, the Department of Water and Power, can quietly continue to get some of the co-op members to sell out the other co-op members, and they continued to buy property until in 1924, someone, and it recently came out in the news, but I don't remember who it was, they started bombing things along the aqueduct. They had lost their livelihoods, they were going to have to move, and the tensions were high, and they started bombing what's called the Alabama Gates, which is where water was diverted from. Water is diverted through a gate. It's called a gate. You open the gate and water flows. You close the gate and the water stops. Now, remember, banks weren't federally insured then. They were self-insured, which means that if a bank failed, the federal government didn't step in. So after the farmers started to go bankrupt, in 1927, the Inyo County Bank collapsed. And what they did is they took every bit of money that was left with them. So farmers that had already started to go broke now had no money in the bank. And this has caused a lot of hardship and grief, and a lot of misinformation about what happened. By 1928, Los Angeles owned 90% of the water in Owens Valley and continued to take every single drop they could out of it, decimating the environment. Something you don't see in my PowerPoint is when they removed all that water, they exposed a lot of new dirt, right? The water receded and there was a lot of land exposed. And when the winds would come through, they would kick up that dirt and making it basically an unlivable place. It was like a dust storm 24/7. So when things got bad, they even got worse. There were a lot of health issues associated with breathing in this dirt. It was a real problem. It eliminated the Owens Valley farming. It was a thriving farm community before that. It devastated the ecosystem, and it led to what is called the California Water Wars, and that involved the dynamiting, the backbiting, burning. It was pretty ugly. But what happened in Los Angeles is with the completion of the aqueduct, LA grew from 61 to 440 square miles. The expansion of the city was phenomenal. So the water was not deposited in Los Angeles proper. It went to the San Fernando Valley. But what LADWP did is they said, you cannot have any of this water unless you purchase it from us. We own it, and we are going to annex you to part of Los Angeles before you can get the water. So that's how you have places like San Fernando Valley becoming part of Los Angeles. They were annexed to LA, and then they could get their water. So another couple points I'd like you to remember is that this process was done legally. The permits to take water were granted by the State Water Resources Control Board. When Fred Eaton went up and purchased the land, he did that legally. There was nothing illegal about it. Now, is it morally ambiguous? Sure. But is it legal? Absolutely. So they took so much water from this area that eventually environmental groups and people who continued to live there sued. And the State Water Resources Control Board limited their exports from that area to 10,000 acre-feet, I think, a year. At one point, they've been taking upward of 50,000 acre-feet, which is a phenomenal amount of water. But once it was legally limited to 10,000 acre-feet a year, they could start to restore the habitat, and it became a little bit more livable. At some point also, LADWP had to start mitigating the air quality issues and the fish habitat issues. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. I'm always interested in your comments and suggestions, so do not hesitate. And thank you very much. You guys have a great day.